Poor student works overtime to help a stranger, later learns he's the school's secret donor. Alex Morgan had heard those words whispered in the hallways of Westlake University, an urban legend about some mysterious benefactor who swooped in to save deserving students from financial ruin. But legends were just that, stories people told to make the world seem less cruel, less indifferent to those struggling to survive. And Alex was certainly struggling. The ancient radiator in his studio apartment hissed and clanked, producing more noise than heat as December winds rattled the single-pane windows. Alex hunched over his textbooks, wrapped in 2 sweaters and his only winter coat, fingers stiff with cold as he flipped through pages of advanced economic theory. 3 empty ramen cups formed a small tower beside his laptop. Breakfast, lunch, and dinner, all identical in their sodium-heavy mediocrity. His phone buzzed with a calendar alert. Shift at Donnelly's starts in 30 minutes. Alex sighed, his breath visible in the chilled air of his apartment. Sleep would have to wait. Again. He closed his textbook with the reverence of someone setting aside something precious. In many ways it was. His education was the only inheritance he had, the only path out of the generational poverty that had defined his family for decades. Just 2 more years, he whispered to himself, a mantra repeated so often it had worn grooves in his mind. 2 more years of juggling 3 jobs and a full course load. 2 more years of choosing between heating his apartment and eating something that didn't come in a styrofoam cup. 2 more years until his economics degree would, hopefully, transform into a job that paid enough to help his mother with her medical bills. Outside, the city was transforming into its winter self. Holiday lights twinkled along the commercial streets, and the air carried the scent of pine and cinnamon from the Christmas market in the town square. But the beauty felt distant to Alex, like watching a movie through someone else's window. His Westlake University scarf, a second-hand purchase from the campus thrift store, was wrapped tightly around his neck as he pedaled his bicycle through the slush-covered streets toward Donnelly's Cafe. The warmth of the cafe hit him like an embrace when he pushed through the door, the bell jingling cheerfully above his head. The smell of freshly ground coffee beans and baked goods momentarily distracted him from the bone-deep exhaustion that had become his constant companion. "You're early, Morgan," called Sophia, the 50-something manager whose gruff exterior hid a surprisingly soft heart. She was wiping down the espresso machine, her dark curls escaping from beneath a red bandana. "Thought I'd get a head start on the holiday rush," Alex replied, hanging his coat on the employee hook, revealing the coffee stains on his white button-down shirt that no amount of scrubbing seemed to remove. Sophia's eyes narrowed with maternal concern. "You look like hell warmed over." "Midterms," Alex said simply, though it was only partially true. Midterms, plus a broken heater, plus picking up extra shifts at the campus library and his weekend job at the grocery store. But complaining wouldn't change anything, and Alex had learned long ago that stoicism was more efficient than self-pity. The cafe filled quickly as evening approached, students seeking caffeine for late-night study sessions, couples on dates, professionals winding down after work. Alex moved efficiently behind the counter, his hands performing the familiar dance of the barista, grinding, tamping, brewing, steaming, while his mind calculated how many hours of sleep he could afford if he started his economics paper immediately after his shift. It was during a rare lull, just after the post-dinner crowd had dispersed, that the old man first came in. The bell chimed softly as the door opened, admitting a gust of cold air and a tall, lean figure who moved with the deliberate care of someone nursing old injuries. He was perhaps in his late 60s, with a full head of silver hair and a neatly trimmed beard. His clothes were clean but worn, a navy pea coat with frayed cuffs, corduroy pants that had faded at the knees, scuffed leather shoes polished to hide their age. "Good evening," the man said, his voice surprisingly warm and rich. "Are you still serving coffee at this hour?" "Until closing," Alex replied with his customer service smile, the one that didn't quite reach his tired eyes. "What can I get you?" The man studied the menu board with careful consideration. "A simple black coffee, please. Medium roast if you have it." As Alex prepared the coffee, he noticed the man's hands, long-fingered and elegant, but marked with liver spots and prominent veins. They trembled slightly as he reached for his wallet, extracting a crisp $5 bill with careful precision. "Keep the change," he said, accepting the steaming mug with both hands as if grateful for its warmth. The man chose a small table near the window, one that offered a view of both the snow-dusted street and the interior of the cafe. He pulled a worn leather journal from his coat pocket and began to write, occasionally pausing to look up and observe the few remaining customers, or to gaze thoughtfully out at the night. Alex found his eyes drawn to the solitary figure throughout the remainder of his shift. There was something both dignified and vulnerable about him, like a once grand building that had weathered too many storms. When closing time approached, the man was still there, having nursed the same cup of coffee for nearly 2 hours. "Sir?" Alex approached the table reluctantly. "I'm sorry, but we're closing in 5 minutes." The man looked up, momentarily disoriented, as if he'd been pulled from a deep place within himself. "Oh, I've lost track of time. I apologize." He gathered his journal and pen with unhurried movements. "Thank you for the reminder, young man." As he stood, a grimace of pain flashed across his face, and he steadied himself against the table with one hand. Alex instinctively reached out to offer support, but the man waved him off with a gentle smile. "Just stiff joints protesting the cold. Nothing to worry about." Alex nodded, stepping back to give the man space, but remained close enough to help if needed. The man buttoned his coat with careful deliberation, wrapping a threadbare scarf around his neck. "Do you have far to go?" Alex found himself asking. "It's gotten colder since you came in." "Just to the bus stop," the man replied. "Though I fear I've missed the last one for the night." Alex glanced at the clock above the counter. The last bus on that route had indeed departed 20 minutes ago. "I can call you a cab if you'd like," he offered. The man's eyes, a clear, intelligent blue, studied Alex's face for a moment. "That's very kind, but I wouldn't want to trouble you. I can walk. It's not so very far." The temperature had dropped below freezing, and the forecast called for more snow. The thought of this elderly man walking miles in such conditions made something twist uncomfortably in Alex's chest. "My shift just ended," he heard himself saying. "I have my bicycle. I could give you a ride, if you don't mind sitting on the rack." Surprise, then something like quiet delight transformed the man's weathered face. "Are you certain?" "I wouldn't want to impose." "It's no imposition," Alex said, and was surprised to find he meant it. Despite his exhaustion, despite the paper waiting to be written, the idea of helping this stranger felt inexplicably important. Sophia, who had been pretending not to eavesdrop while wiping down tables, shot Alex an approving look. "I'll finish closing up, Morgan. You go on." 10 minutes later, Alex was pedaling carefully through the quiet streets, the old man perched somewhat precariously on the rack behind him. He had introduced himself simply as Thomas, offering no last name. His directions led them away from the University District, toward a neighborhood of once grand Victorian homes that had been subdivided into apartments over the decades. "This one?" Thomas said finally, pointing to a narrow brick building with a sagging porch. "Thank you for the adventure. It's been many years since I've traveled by bicycle." Alex waited as Thomas dismounted carefully, ready to catch him if he stumbled. In the glow of the streetlight, he noticed a dark stain spreading on the man's sleeve. "Sir Thomas, you're bleeding." Thomas looked down with mild surprise. It seems my bandage has come loose." "Not to worry," but the size of the stain concerned Alex. "Do you need help? Is there someone inside who can assist you?" A shadow passed over Thomas's face. "No, no one. But truly it's a small matter. Just an old wound that's being stubborn about healing." Alex hesitated, torn between the urgency of his waiting schoolwork and the obvious need before him. Thomas seemed to read his thoughts. "You've been more than kind already, young man. Please don't trouble yourself further." Perhaps it was the gentleness in the old man's voice, or the dignity with which he stood there bleeding in the cold. But Alex made a decision that would alter the course of both their lives. "I have a first aid kit in my backpack. Let me at least help you bandage it properly before I go." Thomas regarded him thoughtfully before nodding. "Very well. I'd be grateful for the assistance." The apartment building's interior was as neglected as its exterior. Peeling wallpaper, flickering fluorescent lights, the smell of old cooking, and cheap cleaning supplies. Thomas lived on the 3rd floor, and Alex noticed how he paused on each landing, one hand pressed against his side, breathing carefully through what was clearly significant pain. The apartment itself was small but meticulously organized. Bookshelves lined every available wall, filled with well-worn volumes on history, philosophy, literature, and science. A desk by the window held neat stacks of papers and a dated laptop. The furniture was sparse and old but clean. A threadbare armchair, a small dining table with 2 mismatched chairs, a narrow bed visible through an open doorway. What struck Alex most was the absence of photographs or personal mementos. No family pictures, no souvenirs, no evidence of a life beyond these rooms and these books. "The bathroom is through there," Thomas directed, gesturing to a narrow door. You'll find clean towels in the cabinet. Alex washed his hands thoroughly before retrieving his first aid kit from his backpack. When he returned to the main room, Thomas had removed his coat and rolled up his shirt sleeve, revealing a bandage soaked through with blood. May I? Alex asked, setting his supplies on the table. Thomas nodded, extending his arm. Alex worked carefully, removing the old bandage to reveal a jagged wound about 3 inches long on the forearm, poorly stitched and showing signs of infection around the edges. This needs medical attention, Alex said, alarmed by what he was seeing. These stitches aren't holding, and there's infection setting in. Hospitals ask too many questions. Thomas replied with a wariness that suggested long acquaintance with such situations. Alex looked up, really looking at the man's face for the first time. Behind the dignified exterior, he saw exhaustion and pain carefully contained. What happened? Thomas was quiet for a moment, then sighed. There are people in this world who believe an old man walking alone at night must have something worth taking. When I explained I had nothing of value, they expressed their disappointment. Physically. You were mugged? When? 3 nights ago. It's not important, but it was important. Alex could see that beyond the arm wound, Thomas was favoring his right side, suggesting ribs that were likely bruised or cracked. And there was a fading bruise near his temple, partially hidden by his silver hair. I'm studying pre-med before I switch to economics, Alex said, a small lie meant to establish credibility. I can clean this properly and rebandage it, but you really should see a doctor. This needs antibiotics at minimum. Thomas smiled faintly. And yet you're working as a barista. Life takes unexpected turns, Alex replied, focusing on cleaning the wound with antiseptic from his kit. Hold still, this will sting. Thomas didn't flinch as Alex worked, cleaning the wound thoroughly and applying antibiotic ointment before wrapping it with fresh gauze and securing it properly. Thank you, Thomas said when Alex had finished. You have a gentle touch. My mom's a nursing assistant, Alex explained, packing up his supplies. She taught me the basics. He hesitated, then added, Are you sure there's no one I can call for you? Family? Friends? A profound sadness flickered across Thomas's face. There and gone so quickly, Alex almost missed it. No, there's no one, but please don't concern yourself. I've managed on my own for many years now. Alex glanced at his watch. It was nearing midnight. His economics paper loomed, as did his 8 a.m. shift at the grocery store before classes. Yet something about leaving Thomas alone in this state felt wrong. Do you have food here? Medicines? He asked, looking around the Spartan apartment. Some bread and cheese in the refrigerator, Thomas replied. And I have basic painkillers. More than sufficient. It wasn't sufficient. Not for a man his age recovering from an assault, with an infected wound and likely other injuries. Alex made another decision. I'll be back tomorrow evening after my shift, he said, standing to go. With proper food and some medical supplies. And he added with gentle firmness, if that infection isn't improving, I'm taking you to the clinic whether you like it or not. Surprise registered on Thomas's face, followed by something more complex, a mixture of gratitude and what might have been shame. You needn't do that. You're clearly a busy young man with your own concerns. Maybe I need to do it, Alex replied simply. Get some rest, Thomas. I'll see you tomorrow. As Alex pedaled home through the silent, snow-dusted streets, his mind should have been on his unwritten paper, on the hours of sleep he was losing, on the paycheck that would barely cover his rent. Instead, he found himself thinking of Thomas's apartment, filled with books but empty of human connection. Of the way he'd said, there's no one with such quiet finality. For the first time in months, Alex's own problems seemed less overwhelming in comparison. The next day passed in a blur of exhaustion. Alex moved from his grocery store shift to his classes to the library, functioning on autopilot. During his lunch break, if 15 minutes could be called a break, he used his phone to research wound care and affordable clinics. Between classes, he stopped at a pharmacy to purchase proper medical supplies, spending money he couldn't really spare. By the time his shift at Donnelly's ended, Alex was running on fumes, sustained only by coffee and determination. He stopped at a small market to buy soup, bread, fruit, and other easy-to-prepare foods before making his way to Thomas's apartment. He had to knock 3 times before he heard movement inside. When Thomas finally opened the door, he looked worse than the night before, pale with a slight sheen of sweat despite the coolness of the apartment. You actually came back, Thomas said, his voice weaker than Alex remembered. I said I would, Alex replied, moving past him into the apartment. And it's a good thing I did. You have a fever. Thomas didn't deny it, which was concerning in itself. He allowed Alex to guide him to the armchair, while Alex unpacked the food and medical supplies. "You've brought quite a feast," Thomas observed, watching as Alex arranged items on the small counter that served as a kitchen. "Nothing fancy, just basics." Alex filled a pot with water to heat for soup, then turned his attention to Thomas's arm. The infection had worsened, angry red streaks extending from the wound. "This is beyond what I can handle. You need antibiotics." Thomas closed his eyes briefly. "Perhaps you're right." That simple capitulation from a man who had initially dismissed his injuries as unimportant told Alex everything he needed to know about how badly Thomas was feeling. "There's a community clinic 6 blocks from here. They have evening hours and a sliding scale for payments. We're going there now." To Alex's surprise, Thomas didn't argue. He simply nodded and allowed Alex to help him into his coat. The clinic was busy but efficient. The nurse practitioner who examined Thomas frowned at the wound, prescribed strong antibiotics, gave him an injection to jumpstart the treatment, and properly restitched the cut. She also confirmed what Alex had suspected: 2 cracked ribs and significant bruising across Thomas's torso. "You should have come in immediately after the assault," she admonished gently. "At your age, infections can become serious very quickly." Thomas accepted the lecture with dignity. "I'm fortunate my young friend here was persistent." Alex felt a strange warmth at being called friend by this man he barely knew. It had been a long time since he'd had the luxury of friendship. His punishing schedule left little room for social connections, and many of his wealthier classmates couldn't relate to his constant financial struggles. After filling the prescription at the clinic's pharmacy, they returned to Thomas's apartment. Alex heated the soup and insisted on staying until Thomas had eaten and taken his medication. It was nearly 11 by the time he prepared to leave. "I'll stop by tomorrow to check on you," he said, gathering his backpack. Thomas, looking marginally better after food and medicine, regarded him with a searching gaze. "Why are you doing this, Alex? You're clearly overextended already." It was a fair question, one Alex wasn't entirely sure he could answer. "I guess, because someone should," he said finally. "And right now, that someone is me." On his bike ride home, Alex realized with a start that he had completely forgotten about his economics paper, due in less than 8 hours. He spent the night writing it, producing work that was far below his usual standard, and arrived at his morning class bleary-eyed and disoriented. But he returned to Thomas's apartment that evening, as promised, and the evening after that. A pattern developed over the following week. Alex would complete his work and class obligations, then spend an hour or two with Thomas each evening, bringing food, changing bandages, and increasingly talking. Thomas, it turned out, was a remarkable conversationalist. Despite never discussing his personal history in any detail, he possessed a wealth of knowledge about literature, history, economics, and world affairs. He listened to Alex's thoughts on these subjects with genuine interest, asking insightful questions that often caused Alex to reconsider his own perspectives. "You have a keen, analytical mind," Thomas observed one evening as they discussed economic theory. "Your professors must be impressed." Alex shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "I do well enough. When I have time to actually complete the readings? And yet you're spending that precious time here with an old man you met by chance." Thomas's tone was light, but his eyes were serious. "I'm concerned I'm interfering with your studies." "I'm managing," Alex replied, though in truth he was falling behind. His grades were slipping, and he'd been late to 2 shifts that week. But he couldn't bring himself to stop visiting Thomas, whose health was improving, but who still seemed profoundly alone. As Thomas's infection cleared and his strength returned, their conversations deepened. Alex found himself sharing things he rarely discussed with anyone: his mother's chronic illness that had drained the family's modest savings, his father's death when Alex was 14, the scholarship that had given him access to Westlake but couldn't cover all his expenses. "So you work 3 jobs to make up the difference," Thomas said, a strange expression on his face. "That's extraordinary dedication." "It's survival," Alex corrected. "And it's temporary. Once I have my degree, I can help my mom and maybe even save a little." "What would you do?" Thomas asked carefully. "If money were not an obstacle, would you still pursue economics?" The question caught Alex off guard. It had been so long since he'd thought about what he wanted rather than what was practical, what would pay the bills. "I'd probably go back to my original plan," he admitted. "Medicine, maybe research. I've always been fascinated by immunology, how the body defends itself, adapts, remembers." Thomas nodded as if confirming something to himself. "And why did you abandon that path?" "Reality," Alex said simply. Medical school is expensive. Even with scholarships, I'd graduate with debt I might never repay. Economics offers a faster route to financial stability. A pragmatic choice, Thomas acknowledged, though perhaps a costly one in other ways. The statement hung in the air between them, neither accusation nor judgment, but a gentle observation that resonated uncomfortably in Alex's chest. 2 weeks after their first meeting, Thomas insisted on cooking dinner for Alex as thanks for his help. The meal was simple: pasta with a homemade sauce that filled the small apartment with the aroma of garlic and herbs, but prepared with evident care. "Where did you learn to cook?" Alex asked, savoring flavors more complex than his usual ramen diet. "Italy. Many years ago." For once, Thomas offered a personal detail. "I spent some time in a small village outside Florence. The grandmother of the family I stayed with took it upon herself to ensure I wouldn't starve on my own." "You've traveled a lot?" "In another life," Thomas replied, his eyes distant. But whatever came before remained unspoken as Thomas changed the subject, asking about Alex's classes for the coming semester. As January gave way to February, Thomas's health improved significantly. The wound on his arm healed into a pale scar, his ribs mended, and color returned to his face. Yet Alex continued his visits, now driven less by concern and more by genuine enjoyment of their conversations. He learned that Thomas read poetry in the original Greek, could explain complex philosophical concepts in accessible terms, and possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of jazz. In turn, Alex shared his perspectives on growing up in the digital age, his observations about campus politics, and his worries about his mother's health. What remained mysterious was how a man of Thomas's obvious education and refinement had ended up alone in a rundown apartment, seemingly without resources or connections. Alex never asked directly, respecting the boundaries Thomas maintained around his past, but he couldn't help wondering. The answer came unexpectedly on a bitter February evening when a severe winter storm had forced the closure of the university and most businesses in the city. Alex had trudged through knee-deep snow to check on Thomas, concerned about his heat and food supplies during the weather emergency. He found the older man sitting by his window, watching the snow with a mug of tea in his hands, seemingly unconcerned by the howling wind and plummeting temperatures. "You shouldn't have risked the journey in this weather," Thomas chided gently when Alex stamped snow from his boots at the door. "I wanted to make sure you were okay," Alex replied, unwinding his scarf. "They're saying the power might go out in parts of the city." "I've weathered worse storms," Thomas said with a small smile, both literal and metaphorical. Alex glanced around the apartment, noting the extra blankets piled on the bed, the candles and matches set out on the table, the containers of water stored by the sink. Thomas had indeed prepared for potential hardship. "You seem to know how to handle emergencies," Alex observed, accepting the cup of tea Thomas offered. "Experience is a thorough teacher, if not always a gentle one." Thomas settled back into his chair, gazing out at the whirling snow. "Though I admit, I once had more resources at my disposal during such situations." Something in his tone invited the question Alex had been avoiding. "What happened, Thomas? If you don't mind my asking, how did you end up here?" For a long moment, Thomas was silent, his weathered hands cradling his mug, his eyes fixed on the storm outside. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but clear. "I made a fortune in technology investments in the 1990s. Built a company, took it public, became wealthy beyond anything I'd imagined growing up. Had the house, the car, the influence. Then I made a series of catastrophic mistakes, trusted the wrong people, failed to see warning signs, became arrogant in my success." He paused, taking a slow sip of tea. "When the tech bubble burst, I lost nearly everything. What remained, I spent on legal battles trying to prove fraud by my business partner. I won eventually, but by then, there was nothing left to recover. And in the process, I'd alienated everyone who mattered to me. My wife, my daughter, my friends." Alex listened in stunned silence as Thomas continued. "My health failed next. Cancer. Aggressive treatment that depleted what little savings I had left. I survived but emerged as you see me now. Alone, with modest social security benefits and a small pension that allows for this apartment and little else." "I'm sorry," Alex said, the words feeling wholly inadequate. Thomas shook his head. "Don't be. There's a strange freedom in losing everything. It clarifies what matters." He looked directly at Alex. "Which is why I find your situation so compelling. You've had none of the advantages I squandered, yet you work with such determination, such integrity." The storm intensified outside, wind rattling the windows as snow accumulated on the sill. Inside, the small apartment felt suddenly like a confessional space, intimate and removed from the ordinary world. "There's one thing I haven't told you," Thomas said after a pause. "Something I've been considering since we met." What's that?" Alex asked. "I'm not entirely without resources. When my health improved last year, I began doing consulting work, remote projects that utilize my experience without revealing my current circumstances. It doesn't pay much, but it's more than I need for my simple life." Alex nodded, uncertain where this was heading. "I've been setting aside most of it," Thomas continued, "creating a small fund with a specific purpose in mind. I had intended to donate it anonymously to a worthy student at a local university, someone working against significant odds, someone who might use the opportunity to make different choices than I did." Understanding began to dawn on Alex. "You mean, I'd like you to accept it," Thomas said simply. "Enough to cover your remaining tuition and living expenses. Enough to allow you to reduce your working hours and focus on your studies. Perhaps even enough to reconsider your path to medicine, if that's truly where your passion lies." Alex stared at him, speechless. The offer was so unexpected, so precisely targeted to his deepest needs, that he couldn't process it immediately. "I can't. That's too much," he finally managed. "We barely know each other." "On the contrary," Thomas replied with gentle certainty, "I believe I know your character quite well. You've demonstrated consistently in your actions toward a stranger who had nothing to offer in return. But you don't owe me anything. I just did what anyone would do." "That's where you're wrong," Thomas said. "What you did, coming back night after night, spending your scarce time and resources on someone outside your obligations, that is rare, rarer than you realize." Alex shook his head, overwhelmed. "I can't accept money from you. It wouldn't be right. Consider it an investment, then, in someone who I believe will use it wisely." Thomas set down his mug and leaned forward. "Alex, I've made many mistakes in my life. Allow me the chance to do one unambiguously good thing before it's too late." The vulnerability in Thomas's voice gave Alex pause. He understood suddenly that this wasn't just about him. It was about Thomas finding meaning in his reduced circumstances, about creating purpose from loss. "I need to think about it," he said finally. "Of course," Thomas nodded, seeming relieved that Alex hadn't refused outright. "Take all the time you need." The storm raged through the night, eventually knocking out power to several neighborhoods, including Thomas's. They sat in candlelight, talking quietly as the apartment grew colder, sharing the sandwiches Alex had brought and wrapping themselves in blankets. It was near midnight when Thomas, voice drowsy with approaching sleep, shared one final piece of his past. "My daughter would be about your age now," he said softly. 30 next month, if my calculations are correct. I haven't seen her since she was 17. Have you tried to contact her?" Alex asked. "Many times. Letters returned. Calls unanswered. I don't blame her. I was absent when it mattered, focused on rebuilding what I'd lost instead of preserving what remained." Thomas's voice held no self-pity, only a profound regret. Some mistakes can't be undone, only survived. Alex thought of his own father, who had worked himself to death trying to provide for his family, present in his dedication, but absent in the daily moments of life. He thought of his mother, who still spoke of him with a mixture of love and lingering anger for the years of emotional absence before his physical departure. "Maybe it's not too late," he suggested gently. "People change. Forgiveness happens." Thomas smiled sadly in the flickering candlelight. A comforting thought. But not all bridges can be rebuilt once burned. He pulled his blanket tighter around his shoulders. "You should try to sleep. The storm may have passed by morning." But Alex lay awake long after Thomas's breathing had settled into the rhythms of sleep, thinking about second chances, about paths chosen and abandoned, about the strange intersection of their lives in this unlikely friendship. The next morning, with the storm subsided and weak winter sunlight filtering through snow-covered windows, Alex made his decision. "I'll accept your help," he told Thomas over a breakfast of instant oatmeal warmed on a camping stove Thomas had produced from a closet. "But with conditions." Thomas raised an eyebrow, waiting. "First, I want it structured as a loan, not a gift. I'll repay it when I'm able." Thomas began to protest, but Alex held up a hand. "That's non-negotiable." "Second, I want to continue our conversations. They've become important to me." The smile spread slowly across Thomas's face. "They've become important to me as well." "And third," Alex continued, "I want you to make one more attempt to contact your daughter. With my help, if you'll allow it." This final condition brought a flash of vulnerability to Thomas's eyes, quickly masked. Not something I anticipated. Neither of us anticipated any of this. Alex pointed out, sometimes the unexpected turns out to be exactly what we need. After a long moment, Thomas nodded. Very well. I accept your conditions. What followed was a transformation for both of them. With Thomas's financial assistance, formalized through proper legal channels at Alex's insistence, Alex reduced his working hours to just one part-time job at the campus library. He increased his course load and began the prerequisites for a potential return to pre-med studies. Thomas, meanwhile, expanded his consulting work, reconnecting with former colleagues who remembered his expertise, if not his current circumstances. His apartment remained modest, but small improvements appeared. A better chair for his desk, a proper lamp for reading, a space heater that banished the perpetual chill. Their friendship deepened through the remaining winter months and into spring. Alex brought Thomas to campus occasionally, where they would sit in the Grand University Library, Thomas helping Alex navigate complex research topics with the ease of someone long accustomed to academic pursuits. It was during one such visit, as they walked across the main quad beneath blooming cherry trees, that a distinguished-looking woman in a tailored suit approached them, her expression shifting from professional detachment to shocked recognition. Thomas? Thomas Harrington? Thomas froze mid-step, his hand tightening on Alex's arm for support. Elaine, didn't expect to see you here. The woman, Elaine, looked between Thomas and Alex, clearly struggling to process the situation. I'm giving a guest lecture in the business school. On ethical leadership, ironically enough. Her voice held a complex mixture of emotions. You look different. Cancer has that effect. Thomas replied simply. Among other life changes. An uncomfortable silence fell between them, filled with unspoken history. Alex began to excuse himself to give them privacy, but Thomas's hand on his arm tightened, a silent request for him to stay. This is Alex Morgan, Thomas said, a remarkable young man who has shown me extraordinary kindness. Alex, this is Elaine Winters, my former business partner. The significance of the introduction wasn't lost on Alex. This was the person Thomas had accused of fraud, the beginning of his downfall. Elaine extended her hand to Alex, her composure recovered. A pleasure to meet you, Alex. Any friend of Thomas's. She trailed off, perhaps realizing the irony of the standard phrase given their history. I should go, she said, addressing Thomas again. But it's good to see you're well. After everything, as she turned to leave, Thomas called after her. Elaine, how is she? Elaine paused, her back to them. She's a resident physician now. Pediatrics. Married last year. She glanced back over her shoulder, her expression softening slightly. She has your eyes. And your stubborn streak. After she'd gone, Thomas stood motionless beneath the cherry blossoms, his face a study in contained emotion. Are you all right? Alex asked quietly. Yes, Thomas replied, his voice steadier than Alex had expected. Better than I've been in some time, actually. She's a doctor, a pediatrician. A smile of profound pride briefly illuminated his features. She found her path without me. That chance encounter became the catalyst for fulfilling Alex's third condition. With his gentle persistence, Thomas finally agreed to write a letter to his daughter, not asking for forgiveness or reunion, but simply offering his pride in her accomplishments and his hope for her happiness. Whether she would respond remained uncertain, but the act of reaching out seemed to lift a weight from Thomas that had been visible only in its absence. As spring turned to summer, Alex's academic performance soared. With adequate time to study and Thomas's mentorship, he excelled in his courses, earning recognition from professors who had previously seen him as merely a solid but unremarkable student. One afternoon in late May, as they sat in the small park near Thomas's apartment, Alex received an email that changed everything. I got it, he said, staring at his phone in disbelief. The Westlake Future Leaders Scholarship, full funding for graduate studies in any field, including medical school. Thomas, feeding crumbs to a gathering of sparrows, smiled without surprise. Of course you did. Your application was exceptional. Alex looked up sharply. How do you know about my application? I never showed it to you. A flicker of something, guilt, amusement, crossed Thomas's face. I may have made some inquiries about the scholarship committee's deliberations. Thomas, Alex began, suspicion dawning. What did you do? Nothing improper, Thomas assured him. I simply reached out to an old acquaintance who serves on the board of trustees. Mentioned there was a particularly promising student they might want to look at closely. You didn't, Alex groaned. That's exactly the kind of privilege I've always resented. People with connections getting opportunities over those who earn them. I merely ensured your application received proper consideration, Thomas countered. The selection was made on merit. Your merit. Alex wanted to be angry, but found he couldn't summon the emotion. Thomas had opened a door, nothing more. He'd still had to walk through it on his own abilities. Thank you, he said finally. But please, no more behind-the-scenes assistance. I need to know I'm achieving things on my own. Thomas nodded, accepting the boundary. Agreed. Though I hope you'll still permit the occasional word of advice from an old man who's made enough mistakes to recognize the right path when he sees it. Summer brought another unexpected development. Thomas received a letter, hand-delivered to his apartment by a courier service, bearing the return address of a prestigious hospital in Boston. Inside was a brief note in elegant handwriting. I received your letter. I'm not ready to meet, but I'm no longer opposed to the possibility. Perhaps someday. In the meantime, I thought you might like to see these. Enclosed were photographs. A woman in a white coat, her dark hair streaked with the same silver that marked Thomas's. The same woman in a wedding dress beside a tall man with kind eyes. And most recently, an ultrasound image with the simple caption, "Your granddaughter, expected in November." Thomas's hands trembled as he showed these to Alex, his eyes bright with unshed tears. I never thought, he began but couldn't continue. Alex placed a hand on his shoulder. Sometimes the unexpected turns out to be exactly what we need, he repeated, echoing his words from months before. As August approached, bringing with it the start of a new academic year, Alex found himself in Dean Rothschild's office, finalizing his changed academic path. He would complete his economics degree that fall, then transition to pre-med studies in the spring, fully supported by the Future Leaders Scholarship. It's quite an unusual trajectory, the dean observed, reviewing Alex's updated academic plan. But your recent performance has been exemplary, and the recommendation letters, particularly the one from Professor Whitmore in immunology, were quite persuasive. Alex frowned. Professor Whitmore? I've never taken a class with him. Dean Rothschild looked surprised. No? How strange. His letter spoke of your exceptional promise in the field. Perhaps he reviewed some of your work through another professor? Perhaps. Alex agreed, though suspicion bloomed in his mind. That evening, he confronted Thomas directly. Who exactly are you? And don't tell me you're just a fallen tech entrepreneur. Professor Whitmore wrote me a recommendation letter, and I've never met him. Thomas sighed, setting aside the book he'd been reading. I was wondering when you'd put it together. Thomas Harrington isn't my full name. It's Thomas Harrington Whitmore. You're Professor Whitmore? Alex asked incredulously. The Thomas H. Whitmore who founded the Immunology Research Center at Westlake Medical School? Many years ago, yes. Before my company, before my fall from grace. I was a researcher first, an entrepreneur second. Thomas, or rather Professor Whitmore, looked almost embarrassed. The professorship is honorary now. I haven't taught in 15 years, but I maintain some connections in the department. Alex sank into a chair, processing this revelation. So that night at Donnelly's, when you came in looking like you had nothing, that was not an act, Thomas insisted. Everything I told you about my losses was true. The company, the money, the legal battles. What I didn't mention was my academic background, or that I had once been affiliated with Westlake. It seemed complicated to explain. And the scholarship? The Future Leaders Program. Thomas had the grace to look somewhat abashed. I may have established it, anonymously, after my cancer went into remission last year. It was meant to be my way of giving back to the institution that had given me my start, even if they no longer acknowledged my contributions. Alex stood abruptly, pacing the small apartment as he struggled with feelings of manipulation and gratitude that warred within him. So all of this, our friendship, your help, it was some kind of elaborate test? To see if I was worthy of your precious scholarship? No. Thomas rose to face him, genuine distress in his expression. Meeting you was entirely coincidental. Helping you was my choice, based on who you revealed yourself to be. The scholarship existed before you, but yes, I did eventually steer it toward you, because I believe you deserve it. You should have told me the truth from the beginning. Would you have accepted help from Professor Whitmore, founder and benefactor? Or would you have seen it as charity you couldn't accept? Thomas challenged gently. You barely accepted help from Thomas, the fallen entrepreneur. The question gave Alex pause. His pride had indeed been a significant obstacle, one that might have been insurmountable had he known Thomas's true identity from the start. I don't know, he admitted finally. But I deserved the chance to make that choice for myself. You're right, Thomas acknowledged, and I apologize for the omission, but not for helping you. Never for that. The revelation created a temporary distance between them. Alex needed time to reconcile the Thomas he knew with this new identity, to examine whether their friendship had been genuine or merely a philanthropic project for a wealthy benefactor seeking redemption. But as the fall semester began and Alex immersed himself in his studies, he found himself missing their conversations, the way Thomas challenged his thinking while respecting his perspectives, the way he listened, truly listened, when Alex spoke of his hopes and fears. A month into the term, Alex returned to Thomas's apartment, finding him in much the same position as their first evening together. Sitting by the window, journal open before him, watching the world outside with thoughtful eyes. I've been thinking, Alex said without preamble, about second chances. Thomas looked up. Hope and wariness mingled in his expression. A complex topic. Not really. Alex disagreed, taking the seat across from him. Not when you strip away pride and hurt feelings. Second chances are just that. Opportunities to begin again with greater wisdom. Thomas closed his journal. And have you reached any conclusions? Yes, that I'd be a hypocrite to advocate for them for everyone except you. Alex leaned forward, meeting Thomas's gaze directly. You should have told me the truth, but the absence of that one truth doesn't negate all the others we've shared. Relief transformed Thomas's features, making him look momentarily younger. I've missed our conversations, he admitted. So have I, Alex smiled. Professor Whitmore. Thomas winced. Perhaps we could continue with Thomas. I've grown rather attached to the simplicity of it. And so their friendship resumed, altered but not diminished by the revelation of Thomas's identity. As Thomas's health continued to improve, he gradually reconnected with the academic community, occasionally giving guest lectures or consulting on research projects. Yet he maintained his modest apartment and simple lifestyle, finding contentment in the deliberate choices of his rebuilt life. For Alex, the Future Leader Scholarship opened doors he had never imagined possible. With Thomas's guidance, now given openly as both mentor and friend, he excelled in his studies, eventually gaining early admission to Westlake's medical school with a focus on immunology research. In December, exactly 1 year after their first meeting at Donnelly's Cafe, they sat together in Thomas's apartment, which now featured a small Christmas tree adorned with simple ornaments. On the mantel stood a framed photograph, Thomas's daughter holding a newborn baby girl, her expression cautiously optimistic as she posed for a picture explicitly meant for her father. She's coming to see me next month, Thomas said, his voice still holding wonder at the prospect. With the baby. Just for an afternoon, but it's a beginning. A second chance, Alex observed, raising his mug of tea in a toast. One of many I've been fortunate enough to receive. Thomas's gaze was reflective, though none more significant than the chance encounter with a tired barista who offered a ride to a stranger on a cold night. Outside, snow was falling again, transforming the city as it had a year before. But unlike that night, Alex felt no dread at the sight, no calculation of how many extra shifts he would need to cover heating costs or whether his worn boots would last another season. Instead, he felt something he had almost forgotten was possible. Hope, not just for himself, but for the man across from him, and for the principle they had both come to embody, that sometimes the greatest transformations begin with the smallest acts of kindness, offered without expectation of return. To unexpected journeys, Alex said, his mug touching Thomas's with a gentle clink. And to those with whom we share them, Thomas replied, his eyes bright with the light of second chances fulfilled. As they sat in comfortable silence watching the snow create a fresh canvas outside the window, both men understood what had once been merely a chance encounter had become something far more profound. A reminder that even in our most desperate moments, connection remains possible, healing remains possible, transformation remains possible. And sometimes the stranger we help today becomes the friend who saves us tomorrow.